Started on a very hot topic, which is kids who suck their thumb. My friend Erin Geddes is here tonight, and she has practiced over the years in a variety of settings, from acute care, rehab hospital. She was in the NICU for a while. She and I love to talk about our days in the NICU. And she specializes in the treatment currently of articulation and speech sound disorders, oral myofunctional disorders, difficulties with feeding. She's a fabulous feeding therapist. And something as simple, that might seem simple, as what we call digit sucking, finger or thumb sucking. And sometimes that can also expand to sucking on sleeves, etc. But getting that oral input in a way that may influence facial growth. And that's what we're going to talk about right now. So Erin, I just wanted to say hi to you and say, I know you went to a lot of trouble tonight to do this for us. And I wanted to thank you for taking the time.
Thanks, Mel. Thanks for having me on. And I'm excited to talk about this with everyone.
Well, you and I love talking about this. So it's going to be hard not to have us talk for a long, long time, but we'll chat for about 20 minutes and then we'll take questions from the audience. Okay. So here we go. Let's get started with just the most obvious question, which is, when do kids start sucking their thumb? When do we want them to stop, and why?
Okay, so not to be punny, but a good rule of thumb is that we really want sucking habits, pacifier, digit sucking, to really stop around 6 months of age. After that point, it has no benefit for the child. We know that sucking thumbs and fingers, tongues, that can go on a little bit longer. And like I said, we really want it at 6 months. It can go up to 2 years. And then we're like, all right, we really need to start addressing it. 3 years, 4 years, it starts to, have an impact on skeletal development. So we're really looking at the impact on facial development then that's happening because of that prolonged habit.
Absolutely. And we know for sure that babies suck their thumb even in the womb. And I don't know if we have research on this, but certainly parents who have said to me, gosh, she was, every time they did an ultrasound, she had that thumb in her mouth. Of course she has it in her mouth the moment she gets out too. And I have other parents who tell me that they never saw their baby's thumb in the mouth during the ultrasounds. And likewise, they never really picked up that habit. But babies do it to self-soothe, and it's a wonderful way for them to soothe, and definitely has benefits, as you said, up to about age 6 months. Can you talk a little bit, though, about the physiology of thumb sucking and really what happens to the brain and why kids want to continue with it? Because what do they get out of it?
Right. So, we talk about sucking, and when we're talking about sucking, like here, I don't know if you can see, talk about the spot. So Melanie, if you could show kind of with the throat scope, the spot. So that spot right there, that Melanie's putting the tongue up to, it's the palate spot, the incisive papilla. And that, when they're putting their thumb in their mouths, they're really stimulating that area, that incisive papilla area. And by doing that, what's happening is that in that spot, all of the trigeminal nerve is there. So all of the neurotransmitters, so there's 4 of them that are stimulated when they're at that spot. So we've got serotonin being released, we have dopamine, we have adrenaline, and we have noradrenaline being released. So they're getting that incredible lighting up of those sensory, spots in our brains, which is causing that soothing. They are feeling more organized, more centered. As they get older and you're watching that kid sucking their thumb or their fingers or their tongue, you see them kind of zone out. Yep. And they are completely relaxed and nothing else exists beyond that. So that loop is really being fed every single time they are sucking.
I'm talking about how a baby's face is not a toddler's face, it's not a preschooler's face. And that once we get to that preschool stage, have you ever noticed, that's when people start saying to you, he looks so grown up. It's because he's getting more of an adult face. And not only is the musculature beginning to change, but the bones are beginning to shift. And the muscles play a role depending on how hard they pull on the bone or press up on the bone as to how that face is formed. When kids have a thumb in their mouth for long periods of time, especially into that later year of the first year of life, and Erin, please expand upon this, but it will actually begin to change the shape of the palate, which is connected to everything else, and begins to shift the rest of the face. And you start to lose some symmetry, as well as some other things that we'll be talking about in a second. Erin, anything you wanted to add about that, how it changes facial structure?
Right. So when we're talking about that, because like you said, we need that. So our tongue, like Melanie had shown earlier with her tongue up to spot, so our tongue should be up there, right? So go ahead and show them, Mel. So our tongue should be resting up there all the time. And then it should be lightly kind of suctioned up so that, the tongue is helping expand that palate into a nice U-shaped palate. So just like Melanie's demonstrating. So it's, that's where our tongue should be naturally just kind of hanging out and resting. When we have our thumb or our fingers in our mouth constantly, and we're pushing, that's the force that's on the roof of our mouth. Then instead of having this nice U shape, all of a sudden it's starting to just get more and more narrow and higher. And so that higher part that's being pushed into that nasal cavity. So that's when we start to look at and see, okay, there's going to be some airway issues with that because we don't have a nice open airway anymore. It's narrowed. Mm-hmm. So it's really starting to affect that. And then it impacts our teeth. So now you have to think that now we're 4 and 5 and we pushed the palate up and now we've got, problems with our dentition that starts to happen because we're stabilizing that thumb or the finger or that tongue sucking, right? So that's starting to put us into like a crossbite, an overjet that sometimes happens, or we've got, an open bite because the thumb or fingers are in the mouth.
Right.
So, and that's usually, like I said, when the dentists are really starting to pick it up too, and the parents start to get even more concerned.
Yeah, and we really want to catch it before all of that. Oh, Erin, I think your speaker might have come up a little loud. Just if you don't mind just turning it down because it's
okay.
Me too. There we go. Can you hear me okay? Great.
Yep. Is that good?
Yeah. Technology, no big deal.
I know. Sorry, guys. Yeah. I'm yelling at you.
So now we've talked a little bit about when kids should be stepping away from the thumb sucking. And we've been talking a little bit about why that's so important, especially as they grow and the facial changes it'll make. And Erin mentioned also that when we start to shift the changes in the facial structure and the bones and the muscles away from the way nature intended this child's face to develop, we then can create problems like problems with airway or problems with eating, because it's really hard to swallow correctly when you have a really high narrow palate. And part of the reason why kids develop narrow palates, there's several reasons, but one significant one is because they continue to push their tongue forward to swallow rather than up to that spot and swallowing with the tongue up on the spot and this beautiful peristaltic wave that just sends the food down. We like to see children develop that around 12 months, maybe 14 months at the latest. And if they're sucking their thumb, they can't develop it because their thumb or their fingers are holding that tongue down all the time. So they continue to learn to keep their tongue under these digits while they're swallowing. And these kids will often come to Erin and I with their parents, and their parents will say, he's 3 years old and he's like such a picky eater. And one of the first questions we ask is, does he suck his thumb? I always want to know that. And then I'm taking a look with my throat scope at the palate and the dentition. So I think for many parents, thumb sucking just feels like, a lot of kids suck their thumb for a long time. What's the big deal? Not realizing what an impact it can really have on facial structure and consequently airway and other behaviors like picky eating. So that brings to mind, though, Erin, can you talk a little bit about frequency and intensity and duration and how those come into play? Because certainly some kids suck their thumb and we don't see as big an impact, and others were like, doesn't seem like they suck it that much, but then they're so intense in the way they do it, it can really make a difference.
Right. So Melanie, that's one of the questions we always ask parents to start paying attention to frequency. How often are they sucking? The intensity is just what you said, is just that, how forceful are they sucking when they are sucking? And then the duration. How long are they sucking when they're sucking? Are they just, putting their thumb in their mouth to go to sleep, and as soon as they fall asleep, the thumb is right out? Or is it in the entire night, or the entire time they're watching a movie, or the entire car ride? And are they really sucking with a lot of force? So we're really looking at those three things: the frequency, how often, intensity, and then the duration of the suck patterns.
And Erin, even if they don't seem to suck that intensely, if it goes on for year after year, let's say 8, 9, 10, 14, I mean, I know kids who are teenagers and some adults who still suck their thumb. How much of an impact will that have, or is it dependent on other factors?
No, it continues. It has that impact again, because we're saying that those hands, those fingers are in that mouth, holding that tongue down, and it continues to change the structure of your face and of your dentition into your teen years. So a lot of teens come to me because, hey, it's finally time for braces.
Yeah.
And they can't get braces on or get braces off because they're still sucking constantly. Or they're an adult and, hey, we had braces and now we're in an orthodontic relapse situation because that sucking continued. And then also, again, as you described, because you've got that low forward motion of the tongue that's not in that correct swallow pattern at all. So you've got all of those forces working against you during this time.
Absolutely. So Erin, talk to me a little bit about triggers, about like, what is it that causes a child to suck their thumb, and why is it that some kids suck their thumb when they're riding in the car and others don't, or that other child might just suck their thumb to go to sleep? Like, what's that about? Why is there not a perfect pattern?
Right. And that, like you said, that goes back to having the parents really look at during that time when you're talking about, hey, it's time to stop, right? And you get ready to approach your child in a very positive way. We really want to look at, again, those triggers. So the frequency. So I always say triggers is really equal to that frequency. So are they doing it only in the car? Are they doing it only at nap time? Are they doing it during TV time, during book reading time? Are they doing it at school, not at school? So really looking at that frequency, because those will be their different trigger times that we're going to be looking at. And sometimes those triggers are paired with a sensory object, yes, right? Like a blanket, a lovey, a tag, hair twirling, earlobe, face rubbing,
Sure.
Yeah, they love to rub that upper lip or the side, right up here by the nose rubbing when the thumb's in the mouth or the fingers are in the mouth. Mm-hmm. So we never address those sensory issues in terms of if it's a rubbing, because we know, Mel, that once we really address the oral habit, the rest of it will go away. Now, if we know that like a lovey is really attached, and every time that kid has that lovey, that thumb is in the mouth, we usually say it's time to let the lovey have a little vacation.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then that's when we would start to address.
Sure. And one of the things that I always think about too is when the parents are having trouble figuring out what the pattern is, to record when they see it happening, and also to look at what happened right before it happened. It's easy for us to think about, oh, it's when she's on the bus, but maybe it's really that she had a very stressful math class, and math class only happens on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at the end of school. But on Tuesdays and Thursdays, she might suck her thumb a little bit, but not that much, but really intensely Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. So it requires some detective work, because maybe there's a lot of anxiety around math, or maybe it was just very stimulating and super fun, and she's trying to find a way to calm down and self-regulate. So is part of your treatment plan then to help these kids find other ways to calm down and regulate? And what would some of those ideas be for parents?
Right. Yeah. And that's great lead in, Mel. So we look at like that, like what are the frequencies, what are the triggers, and then how do we support that? So we really need to look at why the thumb sucking is occurring. So not only when, but the why of it is super important. And we know that there's, with thumb sucking comes a kind of a highly associated with airway issues or tethered oral tissues. So, a tongue tie, lip ties. So we really want to make sure that all of those have been ruled out
Sure.
while, before we really say, okay, it's time to start eliminating this habit. Right. And when we start to eliminate that habit, some fun ways to do it is to, first of all, you need to make sure the kid has buy-in, right? Like they have to decide that it's time. I mean, it really needs to be their decision. They need to have ownership over it. And furthermore, they need to know it's going to be so much fun. Like it is such a fun experience. And every kid feels so empowered. Their self-esteem goes up and they realize that they really can do hard things.
Yeah.
And, and so, so one of the ways we start to address that, right, is it's easy to say, well, we can give them some jewelry to chew on to kind of, replace a thumb or a digit. But really what I like to do with the kids is really get them started on putting that tongue up to spot and getting more and more aware of where that spot is, because that's where it's all happening. I mean, that soothing feeling that they get is because they're activating that spot. If we can get their tongue to do that, which is what Mother Nature had intended it to do, then we're getting there even quicker. Some other things that, obviously we talk about doing is the reward parts, right? Like really making it just an overall fun experience for these kids. And then once they know to get that tongue up to spot, we're using barriers to help them along the way. And by barriers, what I'm talking about is like, thumb guards, finger guards, Band-Aids, fun Band-Aids. With some of my older kids, I am really big at I'm like using rings, like really big, something that they have to take off in order to get to that finger or thumb. Some of my kids love using their baseball batting gloves at night or during the day when they are ready to suck. And then we really center it around, like you said, like what were the triggers and how can we go about changing those triggers? What are some other things we can do? If it's an older kid and we're talking about anxiety, let's start addressing where that anxiety is and, what we can do with that in terms of, giving them some real tools for that, whether it's some deep breathing, some yoga.
Right. And whether it's even just learning to put your tongue up on your spot, Erin, as you know, I work with a lot of children with avoidant restrictive food intake disorder and anxiety around eating. And one of the first things I teach them is how to make sure that their tongue is up on their spot, because when you're pressing on that spot throughout the day, and these are kids with high anxiety all the time, 100% of the time, I feel comfortable telling everybody this, these kids report to me, I feel better. And often they haven't kept their tongue up there. They may have more of a low resting posture, but because their anxiety is so high and they start to press on that magic spot that we've been talking about, and all of those neurotransmitters are released that we chatted about, they feel the difference, maybe more than, the average person, because their anxiety is up here. And so it makes a real difference for them to kind of bring it on down. And we do a lot of other work too, but ever since I started doing that, I am just 100%. The kids say, I can really feel that.
Right. That's how you get them to stop the habit, right? Is you've got to replace it with what Mother Nature got it intended, was that tongue up to that spot.
Yep.
And that starts to relieve all, like you said, that serotonin, the dopamine, the adrenaline, the noradrenaline. And it's that noradrenaline that helps bring those high anxiety kids down.
Yeah. Yeah. It's the happy spot.
It's the happy spot.